Do you remember when CFCs were a big threat to the environment? They're going to blow a hole in the ozone layer. We had to do something, and everybody wanted Congress to act. And Congress didn't do a thing about it. They sat on their hands. Jeb Bruman came along, and through the Cambridge Peace Commission, went to 18 different communities in the United States, and he got them to convince the government to act, and they in turn got the federal government to act. Well, the United Nations heard of this guy, and they said, hey, come on in, we want to talk to you. You mean you can get communities to get big governments to move? And he said, that's what I do. They said, okay, here's what we want to do for you. What we would like you to do is start an organization, and we'll back you. And that organization has one purpose. It's to take these ideas in here and make them reality. Can you do that? And he said, well, sure. We'll start this little outfit called ICLEI. How many have heard of ICLEI? Okay. ICLEI was formed for the purpose of taking the definition of sustainable development in here and turning it into an action plan. And they did, along with several other non-governmental organizations. These are large, multi-million, multi-billion-dollar organizations with hundreds of thousands of members that are sanctioned by the UN. They don't belong to the UN. They're not part of the UN, but they're kind of like, connected at the hip here. And they're sanctioned by the United Nations. Well, they wrote a book called Agenda 21. How many people have heard of Agenda 21? Heard it? How many have heard that it's a conspiracy theory and doesn't really exist? Well, okay, good, thank you. Well, there's a conspiracy theory right here, and I assure you it does exist. And this book was written by numerous non-governmental organizations, including ICLEI, the Nature Conservancy, the Sierra Club, the World Resources Institute, and several others. Well, this book was rolled out in 1992 at the United Nations Earth Summit, and it had 18,000 people who attended that. So we're no longer just a group of 11 people who wrote a little book at the bottom of 42nd Street and then reported to a committee. Now all of a sudden, we're getting worldwide attention. Agenda 21 is an action plan. So let's just follow the dotted lines here. In 1976, you had the Vancouver Agreement. That was a land preamble that was signed on to the United States agreeing that private people shouldn't have all that much property because that's not fair. A few years later, this took that agreement and put it into a structured outline. And in here they defined and created a term called sustainable development. That then was taken by several non-governmental organizations and turned into an action plan. And the action plan was called Agenda 21. That's where it is. Well, when that meeting in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro opened, a fellow named Morris Strong, who by the way was one of the authors of this, so there's a tight little marriage there, Morris stepped out onto stage, and I want you to see what he said to these 18,000 people, some in the audience, some on the screen, and all that kind of stuff. Current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class involving high meat intake, the use of fossil fuels, electrical appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable. Now back up and look at that a minute. Let's go back to what I just said in the very first line. Patterns of the affluent middle class. We're not talking about going after the wealthy here. We're not talking about going after the top 1%. We're saying the affluent middle class. Morris is a socialist, a billionaire socialist. He does rather well for himself, but he's still a socialist. And as far as Morris is concerned, when he's talking about the middle class, he's thinking worldwide. When we think about the middle class, we're thinking of maybe people who make, I don't know, whatever, 50, 60, 70, 80, go wherever you want to go. We think of the middle class. When he thinks of the middle class, he's thinking of people who make maybe more than $30,000 a year, maybe $25,000 or $26,000, because on a world basis, that's big bucks. They don't make that kind of money. So when we talk about the affluent middle class, we're talking about people in America that make somewhere between $26,000, $27,000 and maybe $100,000, maybe buck and a half, maybe $150. That's who they're after, or at least that's who this guy's after. But this is just the UN, right? So we don't really have to worry about it. Well, let me tell you something else that Morris Strong said. Isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? Now, I don't want you to take my word for anything. This is these guys' words that I'm using. And I'll give you a reference point. I'll show you where you can go to and get all the information that I have, and then double check it, triple check it, just to make sure I didn't screw up somewhere. Well, at that meeting, they had a UN Global Biodiversity. They had a Convention on Biological Diversity. And they said, okay, we've already said that all these things aren't sustainable. Did you notice under that he talked about air conditioning, but I noticed right down, I guess I can't, can I point to it? There you go. Suburban housing is not sustainable, just in case you missed that one. Suburban housing. Anybody here live in the suburbs? Just about all of us live in the suburbs. I live in the suburbs, yeah. Suburban housing is not sustainable. Keep that in there because it keeps coming back again and again. Well, we had to find out what wasn't sustainable. So at that meeting, they said, all right, we're going to form a council and they're going to find out. So they did. They created a book called the Global Diversity, UN Global Diversity Assessment, and here it is. This is what this little guy looks like. It's 1,000 pages of old stuff you can't do. And if you go through here, we'll read just a little bit of it. On page 730, it says that highways and pavements, macadams, and concrete drives are not sustainable. They have to go. They damage the earth. Dams are not sustainable because they stop and impede the natural flow of rivers. And the earth has to return to its natural state. Our legal system in America is not sustainable because it doesn't recognize the rights of animals and plants and the earth. So we need to do something about that. Private property is not sustainable because it's unfair. It's socially what was the word? Just. Socially unjust, yeah. Remember, it's going to keep coming up again and again. Social justice, socially unjust. It's not fair. Anybody here actually own a home? Anybody have any homeowners here? See a bunch of not? Yeah, lots of. That's not fair. Because there's other people in other parts of the world that live in a tin hut that they don't even own. So that's not right. Consumerism is unfair and it's unsustainable. Page 773 in here. Why? Because let's suppose I go out and I buy stuff. Well, I buy stuff, somebody else has to make that. When they make it, they use resources that generally came from the earth. And since they've recycled that and used it, then that means I'm using the earth's resources. So if I want to protect the planet and make it sustainable, then you got to start buying so much stuff. And if you own all that property and you've got wealth and you've accumulated cash, that's not fair, and you're guilty of using up more and more of those resources. You get the logic? I mean, there is a logic here. It's not a good one, but there is a certain logic to it. And the family unit is unsustainable because there's too many people. That's page 771. Now, if you look in here, it'll tell you the earth can afford to support, well, I can't afford to support that book anymore, can afford to support about 1 billion people. Anybody know how many people live on Earth right now? More than that. Yeah, about 7 billion people. According to this book, only 1 billion people can be sustained on Earth. So 6 of us are in trouble out of every 7 in here, so we better do something about that. They also projected this notion of, floated the notion of a wildlands project. They said we have to be able to protect the Earth. So what we'll do is we'll start with the United States here. And all these red areas up here, we'll just make it so nobody can live there. And that way the yellow areas will be kind of buffer zones, or orangey yellows, will be kind of buffer zones, and that'll be kind of guards making sure nobody lives in these other areas. And then these lines will actually be corridors where we can communicate and travel from one area to another. But this way the Earth can return to its natural vegetative state. That's called the Wildlands Project. Congress almost voted on this thing because all they were hearing was sustainable development. This is back in the early 90s. They were getting ready to vote and say, yeah, we'll approve this. This all sounds good. Let's do it. And then somebody walked with that map down on the Senate floor and they went nuts. They said, that's what we're getting ready to sign off? You see, nothing's changed. People weren't reading the bills back in 1994. They're not reading them today either. So really none of that's ever changed. It doesn't matter who's running it, by the way. It doesn't matter whether they're Democrats or Republicans. They're not reading the bills either way. So this is what they were looking for. Well, where do you think we live? If 50% of the country's become nothing but natural vegetative state, where are we supposed to end up? I don't know if you can see them down there, but there are little black spots, little dots up here. See it? Down here, down around there and there. These urban areas will be shoved into the urban areas. Didn't we already say suburban areas were not sustainable? So this is all just part of that. But somehow we've got to shove people in there. Well, this could never happen in the United States. Even though, remember what it said in 76, land cannot be controlled by individuals because it contributes to social injustice. There's the thread. That's it. Now, it doesn't have anything to do with us because this is the United Nations. So we don't have to worry about that, because we don't pay attention to these guys anyway. Except for one thing, I did forget to mention. In 1993, our president at the time, President Bill Clinton, signed an executive order, and he formed a thing called the President's Council on Sustainable Development. That council, if you go to the United Nations website, not anymore, because they took a lot of the stuff down, but by the way, we have PDF files of it, backups of the PDF, we got all kinds of good stuff. This, however, I think is actually, I'm not sure this might still be there. The President's Council on Sustainable Development was conceived to formulate recommendations for the implementation of Agenda 21. He did not form this council to build a better America. He didn't form it to make sure everybody had a nice little home to live in. He formed it to implement the stuff in this book, which came out of this book, which came out of that ridiculous thing that we heard back in Vancouver in 1976. That's what it was formed for. Now, I thought to myself, okay, this was done by the UN Commission on Sustainable Development, but this is way back here, what was it, 1997. Well, that was a long time ago. Things changed, right? I don't remember what I was doing in 1997. Maybe they changed their mind and they don't do this anymore. So I decided, let's go take a look at the UN Commission on Sustainable Development today, or actually this is in last year. So I went to the very same website, Division for Sustainable Development, April 2012. The Commission is responsible for reviewing progress in the implementation of Agenda 21 and the Rio Declaration. And as you dig down into the tabs and the menus on there and the sub-menus, what do you find? Reports from the United States coming in. Every couple of years is a report from the United States. How are we doing on implementing Agenda 21? So that's how it got to the United States. There was no vote in the House, no vote in the Senate. Congress didn't pass it. Nobody had anything to do with it. The President signed an executive order and he set up a council. The council then began to implement all the stuff that we just saw here. When the President passed the executive order, he then passed that information on to his federal agencies. Does everybody know what an executive order is? Yeah. Oh, that's right. We just had 23 of them. What executive orders are is they're orders to your staff. That's what they are. They're orders to the staff. But who's the President's staff? Federal agencies. That's his staff. That's who reports to the President of the United States. So he's telling his employees what they have to do. So he not only told them, though, what happened is they sat on committees with the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, the World Resources Institute. And anybody remember what they did? Where they came into the picture? What did they do? What did Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, World Resources do? They wrote this. They wrote it. So they sat on the same committees and they write federal regulations together, my friends. The EPA is a member of the Nature Conservancy. Go on and look at the membership list of Nature Conservancy. You'll find HUD's there and the EPA's there. Wow, isn't that really neat? And they get to sit and have coffee together, and they get done to sit down and write regulations. And who gets stuck has to get stuck obeying the regulations? You and me. That's how Agenda 21, or Sustainable Development, got into your backyard. There's no difference between Agenda 21 and Sustainable Development. There's a vocabulary difference. You see, before I started looking into all this stuff, one of the reasons it took me so long to look at it was because they were talking about sustainable development. What's wrong with it? Why wouldn't you want to be sustainable, and why don't you want to develop stuff, and why would you want to take care of the future? That's logical. I don't want to do all that stuff. I never thought of this. This is a whole different take on things. And that's the confusion. When you got a local official and you try to say, well, don't take that HUD block grant program because you're going to end up losing your property rights, and they look at you like you're got 3 eyes in your head. Because they don't know any of this. And here's another interesting point I'd like to make right now, because you're going to meet public officials, and I hope you go out and tell your friends about this, and like your website, you get lots of data and stuff, and you're going to get all kinds of pushback. People are going to say, well, this is crazy, this is stupid. We've been doing this stuff for years. In fact, these terms have been around for years. Here's why public officials don't believe what you're saying. It's not that they're bad people. It's not that they want to take your property. In fact, most of the people involved in this process that I've met have no desire to take your property. Now they're ripping it off left and right, but they don't see that. And here's why they don't see it. If you're a public official, you're working in the weeds every single day. You're worried about a garbage truck that belongs to the city that broke down or had an accident or hit a dog, and now you got to pay a claim. And that ties up half your day. You're worried about how many robberies and break-ins that were in your community last month and the report that you have to make to the citizens. You're worried about legal problems that your community faces. So when somebody walks up to you and says, don't take that HUD grant because, oh my God, they're tied in with Agenda 21, they look at you and they say, give me a break. These guys have been doing this for 30 years. I don't know you, but I know HUD, so I'm going to trust it. That's why. But what we're doing tonight is we're getting out of the weeds. We're flying up to 30,000 feet and we're looking down all the way back to the 70s and all the way forward into 2013 and 2014 and beyond. So we're seeing things from a much different vantage point. The members of the President's Council on Sustainable Development, remember, this Council on Sustainable Development wrote what? This. They took the ideas from here and they turned it into regulations that take place that are in America. So who were some of those folks on that council? Well, one of them was Jonathan Lash, who was the president of the World Resources Institute. He was that one picture, that one little logo up there. So he was one of the authors. J.D. Hare, at that time, he was the president of the World Conservation Union. So he was one of the people that wrote this. And here's a guy, anybody know this guy? Ever seen him? Yeah, Andy. Yep, our buddy Andy. Andy was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and between 1997 and 2001, he sat on, 1997 and 1999, he sat on the President's Council on Sustainable Development. He worked hand in hand with non-government organizations like the Nature Conservancy, and they wrote regulations that ultimately implemented the wacky ideas called Towards Sustainable Development, Chapter 2 on this. That was your governor. Now, I understand he's a really nice guy, I understand he's pretty popular, and I can understand why. Maybe he had no idea where this was all going. I don't know. I can't get inside his head. But I can tell you, he was part and part of the problem that brought this right here to the United States. Now, how do we know this is true? How do we know this now has become embedded in our backyard? Because you go to the Federal Register. How many people have heard of the Federal Register? All of us are in here? Okay. Federal Register is a list of all the laws of the land, all the regulations, everything that happens in the Congress is in the Federal Register. So let's take a look at the Federal Register from August of 1998. It says, the Environmental Protection Agency's Sustainable Development Challenge Grant Program is also a step in implementing Agenda 21, the Global Plan of Action on Sustainable Development. It was signed by the United States at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. They're making no mistake, not taking any chance that there'll be any mistake here. This is what they're talking about. These are the legal documents of the United States of America. Agenda 21 is buried in these documents. It's not just there. Let's go to ANOFA. ANOFA, N-O-F-A, Notice of Funding Available. We've all heard of grant money, right? These federal agencies come into your community and, oh, I got $100,000, I got $1 million for your community. Oh, why don't you take it? Well, let's look at one of those grants. This is a grant from the HUD for 2010. On the very first page of this, what does it talk about? It talks about economic competitiveness, social equity, and the environmental impact. Aren't those the same 3 E's that we saw in here that define sustainable development? They're the very same 3 E's. Now, they went further though. If you took this money from HUD, who was HUD again? Andy. That's our buddy. HUD was Andy. Andy Cuomo, yeah. Not at that time. And Andrew Cuomo was out of there by 2010. But he's the guy that triggered all this. These are the mandatory outcomes for the creation of a regional plan for sustainable development. Sustainable development. You will reduce social and economic disparities. That's what this says. Wow. You will decrease the miles you travel in your car, the vehicle miles traveled. Wow, that's what this said. Cut down on use of automobiles. Holy cool. Decrease in housing and transportation costs. And there will be an increased proportion of low and very low income households. Are we talking about social engineering here? Maybe. This is just supposed to be some, a HUD loan, a HUD grant. But instead, it's restructuring your entire community. And it doesn't say it would be a nice idea. It says it's mandatory. It says you have no choice. You will do that. Now, after 2010, 2011, they got a lot of pushback on that word mandatory, so they kind of chilled a little bit with that one. So now the FDA, EPA, and the HUD formed the Sustainable Partnership. And in that partnership, they now come out with 6 livability principles. And those 6 livability principles are nothing but this. That's all they are. If you take grant money from HUD, or the EPA, or the Department of Transportation, because through that sustainable partnership, those are all married. Those groups are all together. They're one. So when you're in business with DOT, you're in business with HUD. You're in business with HUD, you're in business with the EPA. That's how the deal works these days. These livability principles are nothing but simply a regulatory response to what's in Chapter 2 in the Brundtland Report forward. Well, the path forward is a document that was released by the EPA. I said to myself, okay, wait a minute, that was still back in 2010 or something. There we go. So let's bounce ahead to 2012 and look at the EPA. I got this document in the mail from the Environmental Protection Agency. And something happened in January 3rd of 2012 that is like mammoth. And you didn't hear it on the news, and maybe you never heard it at all. The EPA decided to change the way they make their scientific decisions. The EPA makes calls. They'll say this is a wetland. They'll say that bird is endangered. They'll say that river is navigable. All this is based on, supposedly, science. So they have to be able to prove this. Well, they said, well, we're going to change the way we do that. We're going to instead incorporate this thing called sustainability. The EPA's path forward realigns the EPA's entire research enterprise around the concept of sustainability. But not just any old sustainability. If you go down to the 3rd page on this handout, it says, we recognize the definition of sustainability as outlined by the Brundtland Commission in 1987. Not the sustainability that you and I think of, you know, recycling our garbage and using bamboo so it replenishes itself. No, we're talking about this sustainability right here. So don't make a mistake. When somebody counters you and they say, oh, but sustainable development is good and it's been around forever. Yeah, but this stuff is now embedded and infected virtually every part of society because it got here through these federal regulatory agencies. So how is it that nobody heard of this? Why don't we know about United Nations Agenda 21 and the Brundtland Report? How come we never heard of this stuff? Well, that's easy. There's a gentleman named Gary Lawrence, and he, in a document called The Future of Agenda 21 in the New Millennium, and you can Google that, and I think you can still download that. If you're not, you can go to my website, sustainablefreedomlab.org, and go under Sustainable Development, scroll down, and it's one of the pages that we've saved in there, so you can see the whole document for yourself. Well, Lawrence is considered one of the world's experts on smart growth. He was also an advisor to that council. Remember the President's Council we talked about? Our friend Andy Cuomo was on there, and all these other neat guys. Okay. He was an advisor to that. And here's what he said. Participating in a United Nations advocated planning process would very likely bring out many who would actively work to defeat any elected official undertaking local Agenda 21. So we can't let people know that this is what we're doing. So says Gary. So we'll call our process something else, such as comprehensive planning, growth management, or smart growth, all across the United States of America. This is happening in state after state. Resolutions are being filled out saying, by legislatures, we don't want anything to do with Agenda 21. We won't allow Agenda 21 in our community, or our state, or our county. The GOP filled out an RNC resolution in January of 2012 saying, you know, we will not allow Agenda 21. We recognize what Agenda 21 is, and we want to stop it. And yet, the same communities that fill out these forms, that swear they want nothing to do with it, are the first communities to grab the money and implement it. Why? Are they just out to get you? No, they're not. Here's why. Because, as the guy said, as Lawrence said over here, we have to call it something else. So they do. Here's the names that you use. Livable communities, social equity, open spaces, complete streets, low carbon development, consensus, urbanist communities, walkable communities. Have you ever heard any of these terms being bandied about? If you get out of your local town hall, and if you're not, I hope you're there. For every meeting, or particularly everyone that has to do with planning, you should be planted down there. Conservation easements, buffer zones, regionalism, endangered species, and on and on and on. I could make a list of 100 names here. These are all ways to open the door for this version of sustainable development. But if you look at the names, they sound so benign. A livable community. Wow. I want that. But you don't want it when somebody's going to tell you who's going to live next door to you. You don't want it when they're going to tell you how much the houses can sell for in the area. In California, they've got a livable community. And what they've done out there is they've told the local planning commission how much these houses can sell for. And then they take about 20% off the price of it, and then they sell that to the poor. People can't afford it. Guess who pays the other 20%? No ideas? Taxpayers, folks. It's you and me, or at least in California, it's them. That's who pays for it. Then, when they go to sell the house, they have to sell it for 20% less. They can't. The people who sold it after meeting the mortgage payments that they did come up with, they didn't even have to come. They are not even entitled to the full selling price of the house. It's all dictated and mandated by the local government. No matter how you look at it, this, which is called urban sprawl. I thought maybe it was like my house. But no, this is urban sprawl now. It's not acceptable. Instead, we have to replace it with this, which is high-density habitats. Where are we talking about high-density habitats? 1976, in the Vancouver Plan, said that property was an unfair accumulation of wealth, and therefore we had to take masses of property, move it away, and have people move into smaller areas. And that's what these are now. These are the habitats we mentioned all the way back in 1976. By 2012, the sustainable development movement was absolutely nationwide. You couldn't go anywhere in the country that you didn't see this version of sustainable development. It's in the U.S. Conference on Mayors. They approved it in 2001, I think. The National Governors Association approved it. New Jersey League of Municipalities and the League of Municipalities in almost every other state in the country. The American Planning Association promoted it, and President Obama, he has something called a Partnership for Sustainable Communities, which sounds nice, but the only thing the Partnership for Sustainable Development and Sustainable Communities is doing is forwarding every word of this book. You couldn't get away from this stuff if you tried to. It's everywhere you look. How was it implemented and how did it become so ubiquitous all over the place? The implementation was easy. The President's Council on Sustainable Development gave money to different organizations such as HUD. $5 million went to the American Planning Association to create the Growing Smart Legislative Guidebook. And that looks like this. What this guidebook is a series of boilerplate legislation. So if I decide I want to bring in this walkable communities, or I want to create open spaces, or I want to create a community where people live in a smaller area and they've got more area for vegetation to grow, then all I do is go here and I pick and choose what I want. It's all written already. This was done hand in hand with HUD. HUD was set up working hand in hand with the non-governmental organizations that wrote this, that took these ideas and wrote them into this book. Are we getting it together? Are we pulling it all together here? Okay. So they then American Planning Association, oh, by the way, one of these wasn't enough. When you're going to do it for the whole country, you got to have two of them. So there's volume 1 and there's volume 2. That goes through every single county. There's 100,000 members of the American Planning Association, and I think about 16,000, don't quote me on that one, I could be wrong. I think it's 12 or 16,000. A lot of them. There's over 10,000, let's say, active planners throughout their communities throughout the United States of America doing exactly what we're talking about. Well, how does this get into your community? So let's get local now. How does this idea that was in Vancouver, that was written up in a series of reports in the United Nations, that was brought into the United States through President Clinton's executive order, that was then pushed down into federal agencies who met in committee meetings with the guys that wrote Agenda 21, passed regulations, and we have it. Okay, well, why can't I just say no? Why can't your local officials say, well, okay, I won't do that anymore? Well, here's why. Many of these people come into your community, planners, or groups like HUD or the EPA. HUD now has a whole planning group. They'll go into your community, and here's what they'll tell you. You have a problem here. You've got a congestion problem. There's just too many people living here. There's too much traffic here. You have endangered species issues, or we don't have enough open spaces. We need to return this land more to the wildland to protect this community. You want to have a community that's protected for future generations, don't you? So they walk in and they tell you all this stuff, and you're sitting there and say, well, yeah, I guess. Sure, I'm worried about all that stuff. Okay. So then they send a survey out. Anybody know what a stacked deck is? Played enough cars, you know what a stacked deck is, right? Well, these surveys are stacked decks, my friend. Maybe not every one of them. Maybe there's some clean ones out there, but an awful lot of them look just like this one, which came from Carver County, Massachusetts. Up here, the first question on this survey that went out to the local community was, how important is the rural character of your community, Carver? Well, what are you going to say? I don't care about it? Pretty much everybody's going to say, oh yeah, I care. Okay, so that's it. We're out of that. Now everybody cares. But look at the second question. Which of the following, and they go on to access to rivers and ponds and streams, areas for outdoor education, areas of historical worth, this is buffer zones between different areas. That's interesting. Buffer zones. Okay. Which of the following do you feel should be protected or acquired? That's your choice. Protected or acquired. Now, if I came into your community and I looked at your piece of property and I said, Mrs. Smith, would you like me to protect your land, or would you like me to acquire it? Which would you rather? And Mrs. Smith says, I want you to leave. Mrs. Smith is smart. But you see, when people see this, all they're thinking about is protecting the rural character of Carver, Massachusetts. So they say, well, they're all important. I care about outdoor education. I care about the history. I care about, green belts. I care about land and all that. Yeah, waterfront. Oh yeah, okay. Well, you don't realize what you did when you filled that out. What you did was, you gave all these people permission to protect or acquire your property. And that's what happened. They filled the survey out. And all of a sudden the next day in the local newspaper, out comes this gorgeous looking graph, and what does it say? 79% of the people in your community want access to rivers and ponds. Wow, they do? Okay. Farmland, 68% want access to farmland. 63% want land for outdoor recreation. Well, where do you think they're going to get this land for outdoor recreation? They're going to tie up open space that's potential to be purchased, or for expansion, or maybe your kids will buy it one day. They're going to tie it up and lock it up by the government. But you think, well, yeah, but everybody said this is okay. I'm okay with this, right? Well, yeah, but not really. 318 people responded to this. How many people live in Carver? Top line. Anybody?
9,795.
Yeah. 9,795 people live there. 318 people responded. That means 3% of the people were even engaged in this process. 97% have no clue what's going on. Those 3% drove this entire plan. And this, my friends, is what's happening across the United States of America. We're getting 2%, 1%, 3% of the people, which means 90 or more percent of the people are never involved in any of this planning. You have no choice. Carver citizens up there now have 3 5-acre solar farms. They had no choice because it was taken away from them. Well, this idea of only involving a few people in the process flies in the face of everything that HUD says when they come in the planners, because one of the things they say is, we have community participation. We have community engagement. We're going to come into your community and we want to talk to everybody because you're all stakeholders. And we want you to have a say in what takes place. So we want to know what you feel. Really? Let's take another look. The American Planning Association, largest planning association in America, probably one of the most venerable, most respected, one of the oldest. They have a survey that they love to talk about. 79% of people in their survey support community planning. Wow. Okay. 79% of America doesn't agree on anything. And yet 79% of people agree that we have to have community planning. How do you get those kind of numbers? Actually, it's a piece of cake. It all has to do with how you define community planning. Are you ready? This is great. Community planning is a process that seeks to engage all members of a community to create more prosperous, convenient, equitable, healthy, and attractive places for present and future generations. How could you say no to this? I mean, they'd throw you out of town if you ever said no to something like that. This is like, okay, everybody's dreaming. Well, sure, you got 79%. But this isn't what community planning is about. Community planning is about sustainable development. It's about the dead opposite of what's on that piece of paper. And it doesn't stop there. Capital Region Sustainability Plan is not here It's in an 8-county region over toward Albany. But has anybody heard of cleaner, greener New York? You heard? Has that been buzzing around at all? Okay. Well, part of Mr. Cuomo's ambition, his goal here, is to take this cleaner, greener New York and spread it across all, 10 regions that are in New York? I guess 10 regions he's divided New York into, and all the counties. So he started with the Capital County region, and that's 8 different counties in there. Well, they did a survey. Gotta love these surveys. They did a survey. And son of a gun, don't you know what I came back saying? 76% of the people that we surveyed want green infrastructure. Well, how can you turn down 76% of the people? I mean, there's not enough left to worry about. And they went out of their way. I mean, there was 1 million people living in that community, in those 8 counties. So they went out of their way. They used the most technologically advanced scientific software that they had and the latest survey techniques to be sure that they had community involvement. And you want to know how many people were involved in this survey? Are you ready? Here we are. 1 million people. By golly, they got 96. That was it. 96 people voted in this survey. And yet now, cleaner, greener New York, with the Capital Region Sustainability Plan, is steamrolling ahead at a rapid pace, and they'll probably have an effect by this summer if it's up to these guys, because 76% of people want it. But 76% of what? My math isn't great, but I think that's like, I don't know, 1,000th of 1%. I could be off a little bit, but you get the point. It ain't very many people that have the whole picture. Well, this is happening all over the country. Now, where I come from, when I started my business years ago, that's called steamrolling people. And right now, New York is getting steamrolled into the sustainable plan called Capital Region Sustainability Plan. There's a lot of misleading and misperception going on here. The truth is in short supply. One example is the American Planning Association itself. In the summer, I guess February of last year, an article was written in the New York Times, somebody wrote in the editorial section there, about Agenda 21, which is nothing but sustainable development. Agenda 21 and sustainable development, same thing. They wrote in, and they said, this is terrible. Well, a guy named Don Knapp wrote back. And he's the ICLEI communication director. And here's what he said. We must not allow common sense community planning efforts to be derailed. Let's focus on issues, not on Agenda 21 conspiracy theories. Really? He thinks Agenda 21 is a conspiracy theory? Does anybody remember what ICLEI was formed for? It only has one thing to do in this whole world. It was formed to take these ideas, and they wrote them in this book called Agenda 21, and now they implement them on a local basis worldwide. Guys, that's all I do for a living. I'm a leadership trainer. I meet with corporations and organizations, and I help good leaders become better leaders. That's all I do. I don't do anything else. I don't do shoes. I don't do buildings. I can't put up plaster or drywall. That's what I do for a living. What ICLEI does for a living is they implement the policies of Agenda 21 through a program called Sustainable Development, and 100 other names we put up there. That's it. So this guy is the communications director for the company, and he's saying he doesn't know about it? Patrick Henry, not the one you and I know about. There's a gentleman named Patrick Henry, who was the former mayor of Little Rock, Arkansas. In June of 2012, at a town meeting, he said, you people are nuts. I never heard of Agenda 21. I hear this wacko Glenn Beck talks about it, but other than that, I've never heard of Agenda 21. Want to know who Patrick Henry is? This one? Patrick Henry is the president of ICLEI USA. He runs it here. Now maybe Patrick and Don need to talk to this guy, Jeb Blumen. Remember Jeb from that picture a while ago? What did Jeb do? He founded what? Anybody? ICLEI. He founded ICLEI. That's what he did. And what does ICLEI do? They implement Agenda 21. Do they do leadership training? No. Did they put drywall up? No. Did they rewire your basement? No. They implement Agenda 21. They don't have any other job. In fact, the chairman told us that. In an interview at Women's Media Group, he said, so many items in Agenda 21 cannot be implemented without local governments taking action, so that's what we are about today, making sure this agreement will actually get implemented. Now, maybe Jeb and Don need to sit down and have a talk because apparently Don doesn't understand his own job description. Agenda 21 is not a political endeavor. It's a global plan of action to protect the planet and to reduce poverty by transferring wealth, by converting private property into public control, and by moving families into high-density living. It comes to your community through questionable surveys and studies, through federal regulations, grants, conservation easements, through government-sponsored education projects, and through regional planning councils. Let me just look at that clock there. Okay, we're going to get the reason I look at that clock is I want to spend just a few minutes on regional planning councils and tell you a little about them. We know about local public officials, and we understand that very often they don't see this going on. So the only way we're going to be able to help them see it is if we explain it in terms they can understand. Now, if you want to know how to explain this in terms that your public official can understand, go to that website that I mentioned, Sustainable Freedom Lab. They talk about sustainable development, I talk about sustainable freedom. SustainableFreedomLab.org under, it's on the front page? Scroll down, no, it's under Sustainable Development. Scroll down, you'll see a little 14-minute video. That 14-minute video has had tens of thousands of hits all over the country. It's on everybody's website. Grab it, take it, use it, and run and show it to your public officials. This is it in 14 minutes. If that doesn't do it, there's another one there for 7.5 minutes. If his attention span is just a little bit shorter, just show him the short one and that'll help out too. Let's talk about regionalization. Government regionalization plans contain objectives that are very familiar to those who know about Agenda 21. They establish no growth boundaries, they create forced economic integration, reduce wealth disparities, and they diminish local rule. All of those are necessary if we're going to implement this stuff. So how do you do that? How? Well, what is regionalization? Does anybody have an idea what regionalization is? Yeah. Go ahead, put it.
Oh, consolidating communities into larger governments.
Thank you. You can right up here and do that. Yeah, I couldn't say it better. It's consolidating communities into one large group. That's what it is. So we take a whole bunch of little communities and we just kind of round them all up. Well, what happens when I round them all up? What happens to local say?
They lose
They lose it. They lose their local voice and they lose their choice. They lose their choice of what housing is going to look like, what their community is going to look like, what the geography of their area is going to look like, how the money is going to be spent. And they also lose their voice. Because once your local representative doesn't have the authority that he or she had before, then where's your representation? It's gone. It's just evaporated. Now, it's real easy. So that's the concept of government regionalization. I got out of order here. Establish no growth boundaries. No growth boundaries are an effective way to eliminate those suburbs that we said were unsustainable. Remember we said suburban areas are not unsustainable, and those affluent middle class people, we had to kind of rein them in a little bit. Okay, well, this is how you do it with no growth boundaries. In Seattle, Washington, Ron Sims, who was the mayor out there, created a region. And then in the region, he created a no growth boundary outside the city of Seattle. So the people outside the city of Seattle had all these restrictions and limited amounts of services and very expensive costs of services implemented. That meant all the building took place inside that ring that he created, since there was no more development going on outside. And that drove the cost of housing up inside that circle through the roof. And the people who lived outside, the farmers and so on that owned land out there, all of a sudden their value of property shrunk. In essence, if I got the numbers were property outside that ring, which is going for $140,000 to $150,000 an acre out there, dropped to about $16,000 after no growth boundaries were put in. And once those boundaries were put in, the land inside shot up to about $116,000 an acre. And this all happened just literally within a few years. Meanwhile, right next door, you got Portland, Oregon. Oh, they're down there. You got Portland, Oregon down there. Portland, Oregon did exactly the same thing, and it works beautifully. New York Times says you got to go to Portland, Oregon. It's absolutely beautiful. They created a no growth boundary. But what they succeeded in doing is the areas outside have lost the majority of value of the property. They can't sell it. People don't want it. They have nothing to pass on to their children. So they have no choice in what they do with that property except kind of run it until there's nothing left, pay the high taxes on it. But inside the urban boundary, in Portland itself, you have this beautiful, vibrant community that nobody can afford to live in. So if you go there, you've got the typical socialist environment. You have the very, very wealthy, and then you have the very, very poor. And there's very little in between there. Also, remember this was supposed to be helping minorities? It didn't. Portland, Oregon has a reputation for being the whitest city in all of the United States because people just can't afford to be there or they choose not to be there. So they've dodged or eliminated the very things that they're trying to meet, which is the integration there. Forced economic integration. Economic integration has another name. It's called tax-based sharing. In economic integration, if I regionalize a community, and I take maybe 50 or 60 towns and I roll them up into one community, then what I can do is just take one pot and put all the tax money in there, and then I send the money where I want it to go. So that means if I live in Clifton Park, a little town further east in New York, if I live in Clifton Park, I may be sending my tax dollars to Saratoga Springs to pay for their school system, not the one I have. So control of where your income goes is very important to make this work, because we've got to redistribute wealth. You ever heard that comment before? Wealth redistribution. I can't remember where I heard it. I know I heard that somewhere. Reduction of wealth disparities. We reduce wealth disparities by having low-income housing. That's how we get rid of that. We change the structure of the community. And we also diminish local rule. I'm going to roll those two into one and show you how it was done in Westchester County. I'm going to tell you something else that I want you to check the newspaper and be on the lookout for. Westchester County filed an application to HUD because they wanted to get some grant money. They were bringing all kinds of, $50, $60 million in grant money. They wanted a piece of that, so they filed an application. It's a Democratic town board in Westchester County. They have Democratic, administration. They figure, hey, this is super. Well, all of a sudden, a local civil rights group sued them. And they said, you applied improperly on that form because you don't have the right mix of minority groups here. Now, Westchester had a brilliant mix of minority groups, and they had a good reputation for it. But that didn't stop HUD. HUD came in, and they said, we're going to sue you. So remember, all the town of Westchester did was apply for a grant money. They ended up getting charged by a civil rights group. The court judge found them guilty. The federal government stepped in, and they said, here's what you're going to have to do. You're going to give us $51 million, and that $51 million has to be applied to 630 new houses. Those 630 new houses will be built in areas where there's less than 3% African Americans and less than 7% Hispanics. $51 million it cost them to apply for that grant. Now, these were Democrats writing their buddies in Washington who were Democrats. Guess who got hosed here? Democrats hosed Democrats. So if you think that just because there's a D after your name, or there's an R after your name, or an I after your name, it matters. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the plan is what matters. Anybody in the way of that will be stopped. Well, you think they were done with Westchester County? No, they were just getting started. They were not done. Westchester County then knew that nobody was going to want to have this forced affirmative action housing in their neighborhoods. So they were told, you are going to have a marketing program to market affirmative action housing into those communities where you're going to shove it and they don't want it and you don't want to do it. And they're going to have to pay for it. It was their $51 million, by the way. They had their taxpayers had to come up with this cash. So they did. They put together an affirmative action program. Think they're done with them? No. They were not done with them yet. The next step was they needed to take the planning authority away from the local public officials. You think your public official and your authority can't be taken away? Ask the guys in Westchester County. They're fighting right now to try to get it back. An attorney was appointed by HUD, and that attorney oversees all the planning for Westchester County, not the public officials. So if you got a problem, you go to a lawyer. You think they were done with HUD, with Westchester? No, they weren't done with it. There's a law in New York State called source of income. If you're a landlord, you have a right to know the source of income of anybody that you're renting to. Just makes sense, right? HUD says you can't do that. It's unfair. But Albany says, yeah, I can. No, we say you can't. Wait a minute. Albany says we can, and our own state board, our county board here says we can do that. This is our law. Not anymore. Not anymore. HUD came in and overruled the law of New York State. They came in and they stripped the local public officials of their planning authority. That's how powerful this is. Now, an article here, and I don't know where it is. I just got this morning, and this is something you need to know about. In April, HUD will be releasing a new rules, application for rule. And this ruling authority, it's a single rule, and here's what they say. We are now going to go back over all of the applications for HUD grant money. Doesn't give a time frame on it. We're just going to go back. So community block grants, sustainable challenge grant programs, we're going to go back to all of these. Any one that mentioned housing and fair housing, which is what, all of them, or certainly a heck of a big pile of them, we're going to revisit those. And then we're going to go into the 74,000 census tracts that were defined in the last census. Into each one of those tracts. And there's 4,000 people in each tract. And we're going to look at the breakup of minorities and the breakdown of minorities in your group. And if it doesn't meet what we need, then we're going to come in and we're going to force you to change the minority housing. That's in every one of the 74,000 census tracts in America. How do we know that? Because in September of 2012, HUD is required to file what they call a unified agenda. And that lets everybody know what's coming up on the docket. They didn't. They didn't file it. You know why they didn't file it? Because there was an election coming up in November. And this would not have been popular if people knew about it. So guess what? Instead of releasing it in September, and Congress is screaming for it, where's the unified agenda? We don't see it. Anybody hear of this, by the way, that HUD failed to release the unified agenda? You ever even hear of a unified agenda? No. No. They did. They released it December 21st. Oh, just before Christmas. Wasn't that a handy? Just before Christmas they released it. And in here it says all the things that I'm telling you. That's how I know that it's true. So they're going to put this ruling up in April, and then we have 90 days to try to get Congress to stop it, if we can. How do you diminish local rule? That's one way. Through grant money. People spell their own demise through grant money. That's how it happens. I mean, it's bizarre if you think about it. You're taking in millions of dollars of your own tax money to eliminate your own rights and choices. And yet that's what we do with grant money every single day. If there's anything that comes out of this, tell your local officials, turn down the grant money. Diminishing local rule and regionalization effort is really simple. I form a region, and they go to the people who are all, let's say you're all public officials in here, and I'll say, listen, we're really proud to have you as a local public official, man. It's really great. And I just want you to know something. We're going to form this great big region. I know you're just a tiny little cog in that wheel, but don't think of yourself that way. Because what we're going to do is we're going to just act in an advisory capacity. That's the word to look for. Advisory. We're just going to be an advisory group. Well, what do you think happens once the grant money is accepted and the regulations come down? Then I look at you and I say, well, gee, I'd really like to help you, man, but there's nothing I can do. It's in the rule book. We all have to follow the law. And so essentially the authority has been stripped. Let me run this real fast. This was in New Jersey. I have an office. My business is in Jersey, so I'm familiar with some things going on over there. They have a Highlands Regional Master Plan. The people were told in New Jersey, if you'll just form this region, we'll protect the water, the forest, the environment, the fresh air, the farmland, the natural resource. All this stuff is going to be protected. Open spaces and so on. Most of all, climate change. I think I forgot to mention, one of the big things in here, to protect the future, we have to protect the climate. So this is about not just the land, not just transferring wealth, but when we talk about protecting the environment, we're talking about climate change. So this is all going to happen through this Highlands Regional Council. Well, guess what? 5 years after it was formed, we found out that it restricted development in 88 towns. Local public officials have no authority over local council decisions. Homeowners have to apply to the Department of Environmental Protection, the local one, to do almost anything to their house. Housing costs and taxes have soared in this community. It's done nothing but literally pillage and plunder the people who live in those communities. But that's what regionalism does. Now, in that contract, they said, well, okay, but at some point in the future, we'll give you guys back a little bit of your authority. Isn't that nuts? So local officials maybe they'll be able to make construction of single-family dwellings with some conditions. Maybe we'll let them do that. Maybe we'll let the local official improve a single-family house or some houses of worship or hospitals, approve woodland management and some trails and things like that. But what's happening is the council has the local public officials on a leash. Maybe we'll give you authority, maybe we won't. But either way, your autonomy is gone. It's history. It's gone. Go to the people in Highlands, New Jersey, and they will tell you they have lost their power. Regionalism is spreading across this country like wildfire. The Southeast Florida Regional Vision and Blueprint Plan combines 7 counties through the year 2060. Think about this. Why would you put a plan together that's going to run a half a century into the future? Why would you even think of doing like that, doing something like that?
Boiling
Yes, you've got this absolute control. Now, we have no idea what technology is going to be in the year 2060. I mean, what will televisions look like in 2060? What will iPad, will even be iPads? Will it be gone? Will we be thinking movies instead of watching movies? Northeastern Indiana Regional Planning combines 7 counties through the year 2040. And down in Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama, they have a 3-state initiative that rolls up 16 counties until the year 2055. Government's already come in and they give millions of dollars to one major town, Chattanooga. Guess who's going to be the head honcho that runs the whole thing? You think those other 15 counties are going to get much of anything? Only what Chattanooga gives them. Around here we call it the Albany. Albany gets a check for $50 million. All those other 8 counties, they've already surrendered their rights and told Albany, okay, you decide what to do with it. Public officials have already given up their authority. The Capital Region Sustainability Plan. Since it's not here, I'm just going to buzz through this real fast. You should be exposed to this, though, because it's going to be here. If they're successful in this 8-county region, if we can't stop it, and we are fighting to stop it, but if they're successful, Mr. Cuomo's next plan is to spread it across the whole state. So you got to know what's in this thing. That whole process of 1 million people, less than 300 were involved, which means there is no community involvement. Nothing in the plan protects individual property rights. Nothing in the plan protects local rule. It depends on the Apollo Alliance. You ever heard of the Apollo Alliance? Ever heard of that? That's where they got their figures from for green jobs. The Apollo Alliance, founded by Van Jones, is the group that advised President Obama on the stimulus package and told him how many green jobs and shovel-ready jobs there would be. Do you remember that brilliant statement that our president made in December of last year? There's no shovel-ready jobs. What's so shovel-ready after all, were they? Right? There were no shovel-ready jobs. It was the Apollo Alliance that told them they would all be there. That's who Governor Cuomo is depending on for numbers. It relies on ICLEI for their sustainability issues. It doesn't address ways to reduce property taxes, bring cheaper power and services to rural areas. In fact, it increases the cost of rural areas. It relies on conservation easements. I won't go into it now, but there's too much legalese there. But they take away property rights. It suggests that more grant monies are going to be needed beyond the money that they have now. More grant monies are going to be needed, but it doesn't say where they're going to get it from or what the stipulations are that are attached. They're just telling us all to sign off on this deal. And finally, local officials are already losing power by agreeing for Albany to lead in processing all grant applications. So what happens is they have you've got all these 8 counties over there, 1 million people represented by all these public officials. 25 people have been have been selected, and they sit on the regional consortium. Those 25 people have already gone to Albany and said, well, why don't you just do all the technical stuff? It's too much, but we don't understand that. That means you have no input. That means you're out of the picture completely, or at least the people over there are out of the picture. And once these things come into play, they're virtually irreversible. Once you're regionalized, it's almost impossible to unregionalize and get rid of the mandates that are going on. If you think these guys aren't serious, meet Harvey Rubin. Harvey Rubin, along with Jeb Brugman, formed ICLEI. And what does ICLEI do? ICLEI implements Agenda 21. Do they do anything else? No. Do they plaster walls? Do they do the electrician? No. They implement ICLEI. Here's what Harvey said. Individual wants, needs, and desires are to be conformed to the views and dictates of government planners. In the implementation of sustainable development, individual rights will have to take a back seat to the collective. Who talks like this? Yeah, this isn't us. But wake up, my friends. This is us. This is what's going on across America, not just here in Buffalo, but all across the United States of America. This is happening faster than we know what's going on. Do you remember those 1,500 people in slide number 3 I showed that were losing their houses down in Dade County, Florida? Well, maybe they can get legal recourse. Maybe they can go to a judge or something. That would be neat, except that this guy happens to be the clerk of the court down there. So they're not going to get much help. Piece by piece, this is becoming a reality across the United States of America. Everywhere you turn, it's embedded. And it got there because it sounds good. Smart growth sounds smart. Open spaces sound open. Smart streets sound educated. Do you know they have diet roads now? That's where we take a 5-lane highway and turn it into a 3-lane highway.
Already seen that.
And what do we do with it? What do we do with the rest of it? The rest of them have people walking on. Do you remember when you said,
Or bicycle.
don't run in the streets, you're too, don't be so stupid, get out of the street? No, now it's don't be so stupid, get the car out of the street. What can you do? That's a lot. We can fight this, we can stop it, and the positive news is we're way ahead of them on this stuff. They used to call it Agenda 21. When they figured out we were onto that one, now they switched and they call it sustainable development. We already figured that one, guys. We know it's sustainable development. And low carbon development, we're onto that one too. So whatever name they come up with, it doesn't matter. We're already one step ahead of them. They're running. This, at one time, you could go on the internet and get it from right off of the UN's website. You can actually download the thing right off the website. You know what they did? They scrubbed it. And that's good. They scrubbed it because they're running scared right now. We're onto them and we know what's going on. So they're one by one starting to take this stuff down, except they're too late. Because we've already copied all this stuff. We've got it back up. We've got triplicate backups. And we've literally got dozens of people across the country who are supporting and backing all this stuff up. Here's what you can do. Learn more. I ask you to go to sustainablefreedomlab.org. I put a lot of time and effort into getting this stuff up there. It's a resource for you. That's all it is. It's a place where you can go and find information. Look at it as a launch pad. Take what's there, don't believe it, go somewhere else and check it out. Go to liberal websites, go to Nature Conservancy website and hear all the fantastic things they're going to do. Then go to the legislation. Then go back to my website and many other good ones out there too. And find out, what was it, Democrats Against UN Agenda 21. Great website. Democrats Against UN Agenda 21.com.
She's from California, isn't she?
Yes, she is. Yep. Click on property rights and sustainable development on that sustainable freedom and just start learning. So that's the first step, is start learning. The second thing is you're going to find on there a thing called the Planner's Resolution. What I tried to do is design tools that you can take with you. You can download them, print them, go into your local planning meeting when they have one, and hold it up. What this Planner's Resolution does is it changes the conversation. We go to your local official and we say, listen, if a planner's going to come in here and do planning, we want him to sign this agreement that says before he does anything, he guarantees to protect our property rights. And if he does anything that's going to compromise our property rights, we get to opt out. You're changing the conversation from their conversation, which is steamrolling like Governor Cuomo's doing. It's changing it from, oh, how do we get an open space? How do we get more windmills? Where do you get these windmills out here, by the way? Just drove in town, I saw these windmills. Is that private?
Yeah,
Is that a private thing?
Yeah.
Lovely. I got it, lovely. So you're changing the conversation into one of your property rights. We're all for sustainability. We want to do that. But there's a balance here. You know, what happens when I start to lose my choices and I lose my rights? So isn't there some way I lose my choice and I lose my voice? I don't want to do that. I'm willing to give up a little bit to protect the planet. We're not going to give you everything I've worked hard for. So we need to make that balance. And right now we're at the tipping point, folks. So that, download the Planner's Resolution. There's two things you can do. Work with your public officials and say no to regionalism. Here's a third thing you can do. Get your friends together. Go down to the planning meetings. And if you hear the word regionalism, you always say, no, we don't want to do that. I think that what we need to do, because this planning process has become so infected in America with this bizarre definition of sustainable development, that the only thing we can do now is the same thing you do with a computer when it's got a bug or a virus in it or it's not running well. What do? You have to reset it. You turn the thing off, you power it back up again, and that cures 90% of the problems. I don't know that we need a whole lot of planning right now. I think we have to clean out the system before we start moving forward with any planning. And for heaven's sakes, tell your public officials no grant money. There are strings in those grant money. I was talking to a good man I know, he's an arch conservative. I mean, this guy is like as conservative as the day is long. He and I were having a conversation. He was a mayor of town. He said, I've taken lots of community block grant from HUD money, HUD Community Block Grant Program money. He said, there's nothing wrong with this. I said, you got to look at the fine print in there. Oh, I've been collecting this money for years, and there's no big deal here. It mentions fair housing. Yeah, exactly. It mentions fair housing. And what happens in April of 2012? What rule is HUD coming out with? Fair housing. We're going to go back. So all those guys that collected, like my buddy over there, who's a conservative mayor of a small, or was a mayor, no longer mayor, all of a sudden it's going to get hit between the eyes. Say no to regionalism. Talk with your friends. Go to the sustainablefreedomlab.org website And on there, under tools, I believe it is, just think sustainablefreedom.org, tools, and scroll down, you'll find a 3-step intro. And this is the way you can introduce everything you and I are talking about without talking like, you know, oh, it's a Marxist society and we're going to become a gulag next week and, you know, they're going to be out here with guns shooting us down. That's like, no, that's a no starter. Don't go there. Talk to people in terms they can understand. That's what I've tried to do this evening. I'm not presenting anything radical. This is the deal. This is what it is in your own words. So this little 3-step introduction will show you how to begin a conversation with your neighbors who probably are not engaged in the least and don't know what's going on. Invite them to come down to a planning meeting and start to, you know, listen to what's going on and then begin to build coalitions. What you've done with this group is, Laura, is just fantastic. You're a great resource here. So work with Laura and work with all the members of her community and expand this community. I don't know how many people are in here right now, say 50 people or so. Let's get 60, and then let's turn the 60 into 600, and then 6,000. That's what we need to do to get people engaged and involved. And remember, there's no such thing as free money. I don't know where we lost that old Roué, that old lesson that a proverb that we learned as children. We know there's no such thing as a free lunch. We know you don't get something for nothing. And yet we'll get into a public position and someone will offer us $1 million and we think there's no strings attached to it. It doesn't even make sense. And by the way, where did $1 million come from? Aren't we 16 trillion in debt? So how can you come up with $1 million? The answer is you can't. It's not there. They're creating it out of nothing. And then they're going to be told that there's not enough money to pay for this, so we're going to have to raise the taxes on the rich. Except when you open up your checkbook or you get your paycheck, you find out, well, it wasn't just the rich, it was me too. How'd that happen? Wow, I thought it was, I don't know how that happened. Wow. Well, the conclusion of this is our communities are in peril because a small group of people seeks to convince us that unless we surrender our property and our freedoms, unless we subsume our individual rights to the good of the community, the planet will not survive. But this is a false choice. As communities, we can pull together to create our own plans to improve the environment without the control of international groups and the seductive lure of easy federal grants. Together, we can save our environment, we can keep our rights and freedoms. That's the real choice, working together. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.